Azcatl, the giant ant. A journey into Aztec mythology. Close your eyes for a moment. Let the darkness settle around you like a blanket. Now imagine a time before time as we understand it, when the cosmos hung in the balance between existence and oblivion, when gods walked the earth, and the fate of all future generations depended on the actions of beings both mighty and small. Picture this: a world shrouded in darkness. The sun has not yet begun its journey across the sky. The newly created humans lie weak and trembling on the cold earth, their bodies fashioned from the ground bones of those who came before, their veins running with the blood of gods. They have been given life, yes, but life without sustenance is merely a prolonged death. The gods look down upon their fragile creations and realize, with dawning horror, that their masterwork is unraveling before it has truly begun. What will the humans eat? This single question echoes through the paradise of Tamoanchan, where the gods have gathered in desperate council. They have sacrificed everything to bring forth this new age, this fifth sun that now hangs motionless in the heavens. And yet, for all their cosmic power, for all their ability to tear apart primordial sea monsters and construct the earth from their scattered remains, they cannot seem to solve this most fundamental problem. The newly made people are starving. Their bodies, still soft and uncertain, grow weaker with each passing moment. And then, in this moment of divine crisis, something extraordinary happens. Something so small, so seemingly insignificant, that most would overlook it entirely. A red ant emerges from the shadows. But this is no ordinary ant. This creature, known in the ancient Nahuatl tongue as Azcatl, is something far more remarkable. In some tellings, this ant appears larger than 3 jaguars combined. Its body a series of hypnotic curves that can entrance any creature foolish enough to stare too long. In other versions, the ant appears smaller, humble even, yet carries within its tiny form a secret that will save all of humanity. Tonight, we are going to explore one of the most fascinating and overlooked figures in all of Mesoamerican mythology. We are going to travel back thousands of years, to a time when the Valley of Mexico was young and the world itself was being remade. We will walk alongside gods and monsters, through underworlds and paradises, across mountains that contain within them the very essence of life itself. This is the story of Azcatl, the giant ant. And by the end of our journey together, you will never look at these tiny creatures the same way again. But before we can truly understand the significance of Azcatl, we need to set the stage. We need to understand the cosmic drama that was unfolding, the desperate circumstances that made a simple ant into one of the most important figures in Aztec creation mythology. Because in the worldview of the ancient Mexica people, nothing existed in isolation. Every creature, every plant, every stone was woven into a grand narrative of creation, destruction, and renewal. The Aztecs did not inherit their mythology fully formed. They were, in many ways, the inheritors of thousands of years of Mesoamerican tradition. When they arrived in the Valley of Mexico sometime in the 12th or 13th century, they encountered civilizations that had been building temples and telling stories for millennia. The great city of Teotihuacan, with its massive pyramids of the sun and moon, had already risen and fallen centuries before the first Aztecs set foot in central Mexico. The Toltecs, whom the Aztecs revered as the originators of all culture and refinement, had established their great capital of Tula and seen it destroyed. The Aztecs absorbed these traditions, adopted these gods, and wove them together into something new. They took the feathered serpent Quetzalcoatl from earlier cultures and made him their own. They inherited the rain god Tlaloc, whose worship stretched back at least 800 years before the Aztecs even existed. And somewhere in this grand synthesis of belief and tradition, the story of Azcatl found its place. What makes the Azcatl narrative so compelling is how it weaves together multiple layers of meaning. On the surface, it is an origin story for maize, the crop that would become the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization. Corn was not just food to the ancient peoples of Mexico. It was the substance from which humans themselves were made, according to many traditions. It was sacred, divine, the gift of the gods made manifest in golden kernels. But dig deeper, and the story reveals itself to be about something more profound. It is about the relationship between the powerful and the humble. It is about how the smallest creatures often possess the greatest wisdom. It is about community, labor, and the understanding that even the gods must sometimes rely on the most unexpected helpers. The Aztecs understood ants in ways that modern science is only beginning to appreciate. They watched these tiny creatures work together in vast colonies, constructing elaborate underground cities, farming fungus gardens, caring for their young with devotion that put many larger creatures to shame. They saw in the ant a model for their own society, where each individual had a role to play and the community's survival depended on everyone fulfilling their purpose. So when the gods found themselves faced with an impossible problem, it makes perfect sense, within the logic of Aztec mythology, that the solution would come from an ant, not from a jaguar, symbol of strength and warfare, not from an eagle, soaring high above the earth, but from a creature that spends its life working in darkness, carrying burdens far heavier than itself, building something greater than any individual could achieve alone. As you settle in for this journey, let your mind drift back across the centuries. Imagine yourself in the heart of ancient Mexico, surrounded by volcanic mountains that pierce the sky. Feel the thin air of the high plateau. Smell the pine forests that once covered these slopes. The year is perhaps 1500, and in the great city of Tenochtitlan, priests are telling this very story to wide-eyed children, just as their ancestors told it to them. This is a tale that has survived conquest and colonization, plague, and cultural upheaval. It has been written down in codices painted on deer hide, transcribed by Spanish friars who sought to understand the people they were converting, passed down through oral tradition among communities that never forgot their roots. And now, tonight, it comes to you. Let us begin at the beginning. Or rather, let us begin at the fifth beginning. For in Aztec cosmology, our world has been created and destroyed 4 times already. We are living in the age of the fifth sun, and the story of how that sun came to be is essential to understanding why a red ant became the savior of humanity. The ancient Mexica people, who would later be known as the Aztecs, understood that existence itself was precarious. They lived with the constant awareness that their world could end, that the sun could stop moving, that the cosmic machinery could grind to a halt if they failed in their sacred duties. This understanding shaped everything about their civilization, from their architecture to their art, from their calendar to their most profound religious practices. And within this worldview, even the smallest creatures had their place in the grand design. Nothing was truly insignificant. Nothing was without purpose. The same forces that move the stars in their courses also move the ant along its path, and the one was connected to the other in ways that only the wisest could fully comprehend. To understand the world into which Azcatl emerged, you must first understand that the Aztecs conceived of time itself as fundamentally cyclical. This was not a universe that had existed forever, nor one that would endure eternally. It was a cosmos caught in an endless dance of creation and destruction, each age giving way to the next through cataclysm and rebirth. The first world, called Nahuatl or Four Jaguar, was ruled by the god Tezcatlipoca. The people of this age were giants who ate only acorns, and for a time, they flourished. But conflict arose between Tezcatlipoca and his eternal rival Quetzalcoatl. Their battle ended with Tezcatlipoca being knocked from the sky, and in his rage, he sent jaguars to devour all the giants. The first son died in darkness and blood. Quetzalcoatl took his brother's place as the second son, ruling over an age called Azcatl, or Four-Wind. The people of this era were of normal human size, and they sustained themselves on pine nuts. For a while, peace prevailed. But then Tezcatlipoca returned and struck Quetzalcoatl from the heavens. The feathered serpent fell, and as he descended, he transformed into a mighty wind that swept across the earth, destroying everything. The people were not killed outright, but transformed into monkeys, scattered through the forests to swing from branch to branch for eternity. The third son belonged to Tlaloc, the ancient god of rain. His age, called Nahuatl or Four Rain, should have been prosperous. Rain meant crops, crops meant life. But Quetzalcoatl could not leave well enough alone. Some say he stole Tlaloc's wife, the beautiful Azcatl. Others say he simply could not abide anyone else ruling the heavens. Whatever the reason, Quetzalcoatl sent down fire from the sky, a rain of burning stone and ash that consumed the world. The people of the third son were transformed into dogs, birds, and butterflies. The fourth son, Azcatl or Four Water, was governed by Calcayutlicu, the goddess of lakes and streams, Tlaloc's wife, or perhaps his sister, depending on which telling you follow. Her reign lasted longer than the others, 52 cycles of years, a full calendar round. But in the end, even this age could not escape destruction. A great flood rose up and swallowed the world. The waters climbed higher than the mountains, and the people were transformed into fish. For ages, for cataclysms, for failures. And now, in the darkness that followed the fourth destruction, the gods gathered at Teotihuacan to discuss what should be done. The city's name itself reflects this gathering, for Teotihuacan means something like the place where the gods were born, or the place where gods come into being. The Aztecs, finding this ancient metropolis abandoned but magnificent, assumed it must have been the site of divine events. The gods knew that a new sun was needed. Without light, without warmth, the world could not sustain life. But they also knew the terrible price that must be paid. A sun is not something that can be created from mere magic or will. A sun requires sacrifice. Someone would have to throw themselves into a great fire and be utterly consumed, their essence transformed into the burning orb that would cross the sky. The gods built a massive bonfire at Teotihuacan. For 4 days it burned, sending flames so high they seemed to lick the belly of the sky. Then they constructed a platform above the inferno, from which the chosen deity would leap into oblivion. 2 gods were selected for this honor. The first was Azcatl, whose name means Lord of Snails. He was wealthy, vain, and powerful. He dressed in the finest feathers of the hummingbird and adorned himself with jewels of turquoise and gold. He made offerings of coral and precious gems, demonstrating his worth through material abundance. He believed himself destined for greatness. The second god was Nahuatl, whose name means little pustule-covered one. He was poor, sickly, and humble. Where Azcatl offered jewels, Nahuatl offered only his own blood and cactus spines, performing acts of penance with the simple devotion of one who expects nothing in return. He was dressed in plain clothing made from woven reeds. No one would have looked at him twice. The moment arrived. The gods called upon Azcatl to make his leap, to fulfill his destiny and become the fifth son. He approached the edge of the platform. He looked down into the roaring flames, and he hesitated. 4 times Azcatl attempted to jump, and 4 times his courage failed him. The heat was too intense, the flames too hungry. Each time he drew back, shame burning hotter than any fire. The gods grew disgusted with his cowardice. They turned instead to Nana Watson, the humble, the diseased, the one no one expected anything from. Without a word, Nana Watson rose from his seat. He walked calmly to the edge of the platform, and without the slightest hesitation, he closed his eyes and stepped forward into the inferno. The flames consumed him instantly, but from that consumption came transformation. His essence rose through the smoke and ash, climbing into the darkened sky. The other gods watched in wonder as light began to bloom on the eastern horizon. Azcatl, mortified by his own cowardice, finally found his nerve. He flung himself into the fire after Nana Watson, hoping to share in the glory. And so two suns began to rise in the east, both blazing with terrible intensity. This was a problem. Two suns would burn the world to cinders. The gods had to act quickly. One of them grabbed a rabbit and hurled it into the face of Azcatl, dimming his light. His brightness faded, and he became the moon, forever bearing the impression of a rabbit on his surface. That is why, even today, when you look up at the full moon, you can see the rabbit's shape in its pale face. But there was another problem. Nana Watson, now transformed into the fifth sun, hung motionless in the sky. He refused to move. The world was getting hotter and hotter beneath his unblinking gaze. "Why do you not move?" the gods demanded. The sun, speaking now with a voice of flame and light, answered, "I require sacrifice. I require blood. The gods themselves must die so that I might live." And so they did. One by one, the remaining gods offered themselves up, their hearts torn from their chests, their blood spilling to feed the newborn sun. The wind god Azcatl, an aspect of Quetzalcoatl himself, performed the sacrifices. And when the last divine heart had been consumed, the wind began to blow, and the sun began to move across the sky. This is why the Aztecs believed human sacrifice was necessary. The cosmic order demanded blood. The sun would stop if it was not fed. They were not acting out of cruelty, but out of desperate cosmic necessity, maintaining a bargain that had been struck at the very beginning of their age. But here is the crucial thing, the detail that brings us back to our central story. The creation of the sun was not the end of the gods' work. It was merely the beginning, because now there was light and warmth, but there were not yet people to appreciate them. And even when people were finally created, they had nothing to eat. The stage was set for Azcatl to make his entrance. With the fifth sun now moving across the sky, the gods turned their attention to populating this new world. The previous inhabitants had all been transformed, turned into animals and fish by the cataclysms that ended each age. New humans would need to be created from scratch. But creating life is no simple matter, even for gods. They could not simply will people into existence. They needed raw material, a foundation upon which to build. And the only suitable material lay in the most dangerous place imaginable, Mictlan, the underworld, realm of the dead. Mictlan was not like the Christian hell that the Spanish friars would later try to equate it with. It was not a place of punishment, but simply the destination of most souls after death. It lay in the far north, beneath the earth, a place of darkness and bone, ruled by the skeletal lord Mictlantecuhtli and his wife Mictecacihuatl. The journey there was arduous even for the dead, requiring 9 levels of trials and 4 years of travel. The bones of the people from the previous ages rested in Mictlan. These precious remains contained the essence of humanity, the pattern from which new people could be fashioned. Someone would have to descend into the underworld and retrieve them. Quetzalcoatl volunteered for this perilous mission. The feathered serpent, lord of wind and wisdom, would journey to the land of the dead and return with the precious bones. With him went Xolotl, his twin and shadow, the god associated with Venus as the evening star, with monsters and deformities and the boundary between life and death. Down they went, through layers of darkness, past rivers of blood and mountains of obsidian blades. They crossed the path between clashing mountains that threatened to crush any traveler. They passed through winds of knives and places where the cold was so intense it could freeze the soul itself. Finally, they stood before Azcatl in his throne room of bones. The Lord of the Dead was not pleased to receive visitors from the world above. "Why have you come?" Azcatl demanded, his skeletal face impossible to read. "I have come for the precious bones," Quetzalcoatl replied. "The gods wish to create a new race of humans, and we need the remains of those who lived in previous ages." Azcatl considered this request. He was not entirely opposed to it, but neither was he inclined to simply hand over his treasures. The dead were his domain. Why should he give up anything? "Very well," the Lord of Death said at last, a cunning gleam in his empty eye sockets. "You may take the bones, but first, you must complete a task. Take this conch shell horn and walk around my realm 4 times, blowing the horn as you go." It seemed simple enough, but when Quetzalcoatl examined the shell, he found that it had no holes. It could not be blown at all. Azcatl had set an impossible task, but Quetzalcoatl was nothing if not clever. He called upon the worms and insects of the underworld, asking them to bore holes through the shell. Then he summoned bees to crawl inside, and when he lifted the shell to his lips, the buzzing of the bees created a sound that resonated through all 9 levels of Mictlan. Azcatl was forced to honor his word. He pointed Quetzalcoatl toward the chamber where the bones were kept and grudgingly allowed him to take them. But as the feathered serpent gathered up the precious remains, the Lord of Death was already plotting. "You have the bones," Azcatl said. "But remember, you must never bring them back. The dead belong to me." Quetzalcoatl should have realized then that something was wrong. Azcatl was too calm, too accepting. But the urgency of his mission drove him forward. He gathered all the bones he could carry, male and female, large and small, and began the long journey back to the surface. He had not gone far when Azcatl's trap was sprung. The Lord of Death ordered his servants, the underworld spirits, to dig a great pit in Quetzalcoatl's path. The darkness was absolute, and the feathered serpent could not see the danger until it was too late. A quail, sacred bird of Mictlan, burst from the shadows and startled Quetzalcoatl. He stumbled, fell, and tumbled into the pit. The precious bones scattered and broke, shattering into pieces of all different sizes. For a moment, Quetzalcoatl lay stunned at the bottom of the pit, surrounded by the fragments of humanity's future. The quails descended and began to gnaw on the bones, leaving marks that can still be seen in human skeletons today. But Quetzalcoatl would not be defeated. He gathered up all the broken pieces, every fragment he could find, and continued his journey upward. He emerged from the underworld changed by his ordeal, carrying with him the shattered but precious remains. He brought the bones to Tamoanchan, the paradise of the gods, the place of misty sky where creation could occur. There, the goddess Azcatl, the woman serpent, took the fragments and ground them on a metate, the stone grinding platform used to make corn flour. She reduced them to a fine powder and placed it in a jade bowl of exquisite beauty. Then the gods gathered around. One by one, they pierced their own flesh, their ears and tongues and other parts of their bodies, letting their divine blood drip into the bowl and mix with the powdered bone. Quetzalcoatl himself made the deepest sacrifice, giving more of his blood than any other. From this mixture of death and divinity, the first humans of the fifth sun took shape. They opened their eyes for the first time in the gardens of Tamoanchan, surrounded by flowering trees and singing birds, watched over by the gods who had created them. But almost immediately, something was wrong. The humans were weak. They could barely move. Their newly formed bodies had no strength, no vitality. They lay on the ground of paradise like newborn fawns, helpless and vulnerable. The gods looked at one another in consternation. What had gone wrong? They had followed the ancient formulas. The bones had been properly ground, the blood properly shed, and yet their creations seemed to be dying even as they breathed their first breaths. Then understanding dawned. The humans needed food. They needed sustenance to fuel these new bodies, something to give them strength and energy. But what food could possibly be suitable? The gods themselves did not eat in the manner of mortals. They had no idea what humans required. What shall the humans eat? The gods asked one another, their voices heavy with worry. Everyone must look for food for them. And so the search began. The gods scattered across the newly made earth, seeking something, anything, that might save their dying creations. Some searched the forests, others the rivers, still others the mountains. But nothing seemed suitable. Nothing seemed right. It was in this moment of desperation that a small miracle occurred. A miracle carried on 6 tiny legs. In the paradise of Tamoanshan, while the gods scattered in search of sustenance for their failing creations, one deity remained behind. Quetzalcoatl sat near the weakening humans, watching their shallow breaths, their flickering life force. He had sacrificed more than anyone to bring these beings into existence. The thought of watching them fade away was unbearable. The gardens of Tamoanshan were beautiful beyond mortal imagination. Flowering trees spread their branches toward a sky that shimmered with the colors of jade and turquoise. Birds whose feathers contained all the hues of the rainbow sang from every branch. Streams of crystal-clear water wound through groves of fruit-bearing plants. And yet none of it seemed to help the humans who lay dying on the fragrant earth. It was then that Quetzalcoatl noticed something moving at the edge of his vision. An ant was crossing the ground before him, but not just any ant. This creature was remarkable in its size and bearing. In some versions of the story, Azcatl appears as a giant red ant, larger than 3 jaguars combined, a creature whose body curves in hypnotic patterns that can entrance any being that stares too long. Its exoskeleton gleams like polished obsidian in the diffused light of paradise, and its antennae move with an intelligence that seems almost divine. In other versions, the ant appears smaller, closer to normal size, but carries itself with a dignity and purpose that sets it apart from ordinary insects. Its color is described as red, the red of dried blood, the red of sunset, the red of life itself. But what truly caught Quetzalcoatl's attention was what the ant carried in its mandibles. It was a kernel of maize. Golden and perfect, the corn kernel gleamed with an inner light. It was larger than the ant itself, yet the creature bore it without apparent effort, moving across the ground with steady determination. This tiny being was carrying sustenance, real food, the kind of nourishment that might save the humans. Quetzalcoatl leaped to his feet. He intercepted the ant's path, towering over the small creature like a mountain over a pebble. "Stop," the feathered serpent commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a god who had descended to the underworld and returned. "Where did you get that corn? Tell me at once." The ant paused. In most tellings of the story, Azcatl does not seem intimidated by the god's presence. There is something almost defiant in the way the creature stands its ground, its antennae waving as if considering how to respond. "I cannot say," the ant replied. Some versions of the myth give Azcatl a voice like crackling leaves, while others describe it as surprisingly deep and resonant for such a small creature. "The location is my secret." Quetzalcoatl was not accustomed to being denied. He was one of the most powerful gods in the pantheon, creator of humanity, lord of wind and wisdom. And yet here was this tiny insect, refusing to share its knowledge. "The humans are dying," Quetzalcoatl said, his tone shifting from command to plea. These beings we have created from bone and blood, they have nothing to eat. They will fade away if we cannot find sustenance for them. That corn you carry, it could save them. Please, tell me where you found it." Still the ant hesitated. The secret it carried was precious, not to be shared lightly. The location of the corn was sacred, protected, known only to Azcatl and its kind. To reveal it would be to give away something that had been guarded for countless ages. But Quetzalcoatl was persistent. He questioned the ant for what felt like hours, alternating between commands and entreaties, between promises and veiled threats. He reminded Azcatl of the cosmic importance of the humans, of the sacrifices the gods had made to create this fifth sun, of the terrible waste it would be if their efforts came to nothing. At last, whether moved by the gods' pleas or simply exhausted by his persistence, Azcatl relented. "There is a mountain," the ant said slowly, each word seeming to cost some great effort. "We call it Tonacatepetl, the mountain of our sustenance. Within its stone heart lies a great chamber, and within that chamber is stored all the food that exists in the world, corn and beans and peppers and seeds of every kind. It has been hidden there since the beginning of time, protected from all who might seek to claim it." Quetzalcoatl's heart leaped. A mountain of food, enough to feed not just the first humans, but all the generations that would follow. If he could access this storehouse, humanity would be saved. "Take me there," he demanded. "Show me this mountain." But Azcatl shook its tiny head. "I cannot. The entrance is too small for one of your size. The passages wind deep into the earth, through cracks in stone that would crush even a god. Only we ants know the way, and only we can navigate those narrow paths." Quetzalcoatl considered this problem. The solution, when it came to him, was elegant in its simplicity. He was, after all, the Lord of Transformation, a deity who had taken many forms throughout his existence. He had become wind and light, bird and beast. Why not become an ant? "Then I will become like you," Quetzalcoatl said. "I will transform myself and follow wherever you lead." This is where the story takes on its most famous form. The great god Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent, creator of humanity, lord of wind and wisdom, shrinks himself down to the size of an ant. His scales become an exoskeleton. His feathers fold away into the segmented body of an insect. His divine radiance dims to a dark sheen that would not look out of place in any ant colony. He becomes a black ant, counterpart to Azcatl's red. Together, the two ants set out across the landscape of paradise, heading toward a mountain that rose on the distant horizon. The journey that would have taken Quetzalcoatl moments in his true form now stretched into an epic odyssey. Every pebble became a boulder to climb. Every stream became a roaring river to cross. The world, seen from the perspective of an ant, was vast and full of dangers. But Azcatl knew the way. The red ant led Quetzalcoatl along paths invisible to larger creatures, through tunnels beneath the earth and across bridges formed by fallen leaves. They traveled through forests of grass that seemed as tall as the trees of Tamoanchan, past creatures that had seemed tiny before but now loomed as giants. Beetles and worms and centipedes going about their business in the hidden world beneath mortal notice. Days passed, or perhaps only hours. Time moves differently for ants. The two small travelers pressed on, driven by the knowledge that humans were dying and only the treasures of Tonacatepetl could save them. Finally, they reached the mountain. Tonacatepetl rose before them, its slopes covered in strange plants that seemed to pulse with inner light. The stone of the mountain was not ordinary rock, but something more, something that contained within it the essence of nourishment itself. Even from outside, Quetzalcoatl could sense the power concentrated within. Azcatl led him to a tiny crack at the base of the mountain, a fissure so small that even the largest ant could barely squeeze through. But for Quetzalcoatl in his ant form, it was just wide enough. Follow closely, Azcatl instructed. The passages twist and turn. It is easy to become lost in the darkness. The two ants entered the mountain of sustenance. Inside the mountain, the darkness was absolute. No light penetrated the stone corridors through which the two ants traveled. But Azcatl seemed to know every turn, every branch in the labyrinthine passages. The red ant's antennae swept back and forth constantly, reading chemical trails left by countless generations of its kind, navigating by a map written in scent rather than sight. Quetzalcoatl followed, his divine consciousness compressed into this tiny form, experiencing the world as no god had ever experienced it before. The air grew warmer as they descended, thick with moisture and the strange, earthy smell of deep places. The tunnel walls were not rough stone but something smoother, almost organic, as if the mountain itself were alive. They climbed over ridges of crystalline minerals that sparkled faintly in the darkness, their surfaces carrying some trace of luminescence from the world above. They squeezed through passages so narrow that even their tiny bodies had to flatten to pass. They crossed underground rivers that seemed vast as oceans from their perspective, carefully picking their way across stones that served as stepping points. Hour after hour they traveled, descending ever deeper into the heart of the mountain. Quetzalcoatl began to wonder if they would ever reach their destination, or if Tenochtitlan's interior was truly infinite, a maze with no center. And then, suddenly, the tunnel opened up. Quetzalcoatl emerged into a space so vast it took his ant-sized breath away. The chamber within the mountain of sustenance was enormous beyond imagining, a cathedral of stone whose ceiling vanished into darkness far above. But it was not the size that stunned the transformed god. It was what the chamber contained. Mountains. Mountains of grain. Golden corn was piled in heaps that rose toward the distant ceiling, each kernel perfect and gleaming with an inner light. But corn was only the beginning. There were beans of every color, black and red and white and speckled, more varieties than Quetzalcoatl had ever imagined could exist. There were peppers, their skins ranging from green to yellow to a red so deep it seemed almost black. There were seeds of chia and amaranth, those precious plants that would sustain entire civilizations. There was sage and squash and 1,000 other foods, some recognizable, others completely alien. The abundance was staggering. This single chamber contained enough food to sustain every human who would ever live, every generation from the first to the last. It was the storehouse of the world, hidden away within the stone heart of Tenochtitlan, waiting for the moment when it would be needed. "This is it," Azcatl said, its voice carrying a note of pride. "This is what we have guarded since the beginning. The mountain of our sustenance, the source of all nourishment." Quetzalcoatl moved through the chamber in a daze, his tiny ant legs carrying him past piles of plenty that defied comprehension. He understood now why the gods had been unable to find food for the humans. It had all been hidden here, locked away in this impossible vault beneath the earth. No wonder the newly created people were starving. The sustenance they needed had been kept from them, sealed within stone by forces older than the fifth sun itself. But there was a problem. Even transformed into an ant, Quetzalcoatl could not possibly carry all this food back to Tamoanchan. He could take a kernel, perhaps a few seeds, but the humans needed vastly more than that. They needed access to this entire treasure trove, and they needed it quickly. Quetzalcoatl picked up a single kernel of corn in his mandibles, marveling at its weight, its perfection. This golden grain contained within it the potential for fields upon fields of maize, generation after generation of the crop that would become the foundation of Mesoamerican civilization. From this one seed could grow enough corn to feed nations. "I will take this back," The transformed god said. I will bring it to Tamoanshan and show the other gods what I have found. But we will need to find a way to open this mountain to release all of this sustenance into the world. Azcatl nodded its tiny head. The mountain cannot be moved, the ant warned. Many have tried, but perhaps the gods together can find a way to split the stone and claim what lies within. The journey back was faster now that Quetzalcoatl knew the way. He carried the corn kernel in his mandibles, running through the tunnels with a speed driven by desperate hope. Behind him, Azcatl kept pace, guiding him through the tricky sections where the path branched or doubled back on itself. They emerged into the light of Tamoanshan, and Quetzalcoatl immediately resumed his true form. He expanded from ant to god in a burst of feathers and wind, the kernel of corn still clutched carefully in his hand, now appearing tiny against his divine palm. The other gods gathered around, their faces a mixture of hope and confusion. Where had Quetzalcoatl been? What had he found? In answer, the feathered serpent held up the kernel of corn. I have discovered the answer, he announced. An ant, a creature called Azcatl, showed me a mountain filled with all the food in the world. This corn is only the smallest sample. Within Tonacatepetl, the mountain of sustenance, there is enough to feed our creations forever. But we must find a way to open the mountain and release its treasures. The gods examined the corn kernel with wonder. None of them had ever seen anything like it. The grain seemed to glow with its own light, warm and golden as captured sunlight. It was clearly special, clearly divine in its own way. But what good was one kernel when humans needed so much more? We must act quickly, Quetzalcoatl urged. The humans grow weaker by the moment. We cannot waste time. The gods discussed and debated. Some suggested using their combined power to destroy the mountain outright, to shatter it with divine force and claim what lay within. Others worried that such violence might damage the precious contents, contaminating the food with stone dust and debris. Finally, a plan emerged. Quetzalcoatl would attempt to move the mountain itself, to drag it bodily to Tamoanshan where its contents could be more easily accessed. It seemed impossible, but then, many things that seemed impossible had already occurred in this age of creation. But first, there was the immediate matter of the dying humans. Quetzalcoatl took the single kernel of corn and began to chew it. His divine teeth ground the golden grain into a soft paste, mixing it with his own sacred essence. When the corn was thoroughly processed, he carried it to where the first humans lay weak and fading. Gently, with infinite care, he placed the chewed corn on their lips. The effect was immediate and miraculous. Color flooded back into pale faces. Eyes that had been glazed and vacant suddenly focused, brightening with new awareness. Limbs that had lain limp began to stir, fingers flexing, legs shifting. The humans were reviving, drawing strength from this most fundamental of foods. The gods watched in amazement as their creations sat up, looked around, and for the first time truly inhabited their bodies. The corn had given them more than simple nourishment. It had given them vitality, consciousness, life itself. In a very real sense, humans are made of corn, and the first taste of maize in Tamoanshan completed a creation that bone and blood had only begun. But one kernel, even chewed by a god, could only do so much. The humans were revived, but would soon be hungry again. The long-term solution still needed to be found. Now, Quetzalcoatl said, watching the humans take their first uncertain steps in the gardens of paradise, we must deal with the mountain. The gods gathered at the base of Tonacatepetl, that mighty mountain whose stone heart contained all the sustenance in the world. They had left the reviving humans in the care of lesser spirits, trusting that the corn's effects would last long enough for them to complete their mission. Quetzalcoatl approached the mountain with a rope woven from divine fibers, strong enough to bind the cosmos itself. His plan was simple in concept if not in execution. He would tie the rope around the mountain's base, anchor himself against the earth, and pull until the entire mass began to move. The other gods watched as the feathered serpent made his preparations. Many were skeptical. Mountains did not move. Even divine power had its limits. But none of them had a better idea, and desperation made them willing to try anything. Quetzalcoatl set his feet against the ground, his serpentine form coiling with tremendous power. He pulled on the rope, and every muscle in his divine body strained with effort. The earth beneath him cracked from the force he exerted. The air itself seemed to compress around him. But Tonacatepetl did not move. He tried again, summoning reserves of power he had not known he possessed. The rope cut into his hands, drawing divine ichor. His feathers shed from the sheer stress of his effort. Mountains in the distance trembled from the force he was applying. Still, Tonacatepetl remained fixed in place. The mountain was not merely heavy. It was anchored to the earth itself, bound by forces older than the gods, perhaps older than time. No amount of pulling would ever shift it. The sustenance within would remain trapped unless some other solution could be found. Quetzalcoatl released the rope, his divine form exhausted in a way he had never experienced. He had failed. The mountain had defeated him. "There must be another way," he said, his voice strained. "The food is there. We simply cannot reach it through brute force." The gods consulted among themselves. Two of their number, Oxomoco and Sapactinal, were known for their gifts of divination. They were among the first beings created, ancient and wise, keepers of knowledge that even other gods did not possess. Perhaps they could provide guidance. Oxomoco and Sapactinal threw their lots, casting grains of corn in patterns that revealed the will of the cosmos. They studied the way the kernels fell, reading meanings in arrangements that would seem random to lesser beings. The silence stretched as the other gods waited for their verdict. Finally, Sapactinal spoke. "The mountain cannot be moved." She confirmed what Quetzalcoatl had already discovered. "But it can be opened. There is one god who has the power to split Tonacatepetl and release its contents. His name is Nanahuatzin. Nanahuatzin, the humble god who had become the fifth sun, the one who had found courage when the vain Tequisistecatl had failed. He who had leaped into the divine bonfire without hesitation and emerged as the source of all light and warmth. But Nanahuatzin was the sun now. He could not leave the sky, could not descend to earth to participate directly in this task. How could he help split a mountain when he was bound to his celestial path? "He will use his stick," Sapactinal explained. "His lightning. The power of the sun concentrated into a single bolt. If he strikes Tonacatepetl, the mountain will crack and the grain will be released." The gods looked up at the sky, where the fifth sun blazed in his new glory. Could he hear them? Would he be willing to help? Quetzalcoatl called out to his fellow god, his voice carrying on winds that reached from earth to heaven. He explained the situation, the dying humans, the hidden food, the mountain that refused to move. He pleaded for Nanahuatzin's intervention. For a long moment, nothing happened. The sun continued his journey across the sky, seemingly oblivious to the request. Had he not heard? Did he not care? Was he so transformed by becoming the sun that he no longer remembered his connection to the other gods? Then, in the distance, thunder rolled. Clouds gathered around the summit of Tonacatepetl, dark and heavy with divine power. Lightning flickered within them, building in intensity. The air itself crackled with energy, becoming charged with forces that made the gods' feathers and hair stand on end. And then it fell. A bolt of lightning unlike any that had come before descended from the sky. It was not mere electricity but concentrated solar power, the essence of the sun himself channeled into a single devastating strike. It hit the peak of Tonacatepetl with a crack that echoed across the entire world, a sound that the humans in Tamoanchan would speak of for generations. The mountain split. From base to summit, a great fissure opened in the stone. The crack widened, spreading like roots through the rock, until the entire mountain was webbed with fractures. And from those fractures, the contents of Tonacatepetl began to spill forth. Corn cascaded down the mountainside like golden water. Beans tumbled after it in waves of color. Seeds and peppers and every kind of sustenance poured from the broken stone, a flood of food that spread across the surrounding land. But even as the gods began to celebrate, they noticed something troubling. The rain gods, the Tlaloc, had taken notice of this spectacle, and they were moving toward the broken mountain with clear purpose. The Tlaloc were not ordinary gods. They were extensions of Tlaloc himself, the ancient deity of rain and thunder whose worship predated the Aztecs by many centuries. Each Tlaloc corresponded to one of the 4 cardinal directions. Each bore a different color, and each brought a different type of weather. The Eastern Tlaloc wore yellow, the color of dawn and new beginnings. His rains were gentle, nurturing, the soft moisture that coaxed young crops from the soil and helped them grow strong. The Western Tlaloc wore red, the color of sunset and harvest. His rains came in autumn, preparing the earth for the dormancy of winter. The Southern Tlaloc wore green, representing growth and abundance. His summer storms fed the crops when they needed water most. And the Northern Tlaloc wore white, bringing destructive storms, hail, and sometimes snow to the highland mountains. Together, these 4 spirits served as guardians and distributors of moisture throughout the world. They decided which regions would receive rain and which would suffer drought. They could bring forth bountiful harvests or devastating famines, all according to their whims or the offerings they received. When the mountain of Tonacatepetl split open, the Tlaloc saw opportunity. They swept down upon the broken mountain like 4 winds converging. Before the other gods could react, the rain spirits began scooping up the grain that poured from the stone. Their arms moved with supernatural speed, gathering corn and beans and seeds and every other precious food. "What are you doing?" Quetzalcoatl demanded, his voice carrying the fury of a god who had worked so hard to access these treasures. "This food is for the humans." "And so it shall be," the Eastern Tlaloc replied, his voice like gentle spring rain. "But we will be the ones to distribute it. The sustenance of the world belongs in our jars, to be given out as we see fit." This was the nature of the Tlaloc. They were not evil, but neither were they purely benevolent. Like rain itself, they could bring life or death depending on their moods. By controlling the distribution of food, they would ensure that humans remained dependent on them, offering prayers and sacrifices in exchange for bountiful harvests. The gods watched helplessly as the rain spirits spirited away the contents of Tonacatepetl. The Tlaloc moved with purpose, each taking specific types of grain and seed, dividing the world's sustenance among themselves according to some ancient understanding. But something interesting happened as they worked. The different types of corn that had been stored within the mountain began to take on the colors of the Tlaloc who handled them. The Eastern Tlaloc, with his yellow garments, touched the grain and left it golden, the corn that would become most common and widespread. The Northern Tlaloc, dressed in white, created white corn from his handling. The Southern Tlaloc's green influence produced the darker varieties, the blue and black corn that would become sacred to certain peoples. And the Western Tlaloc's red coloring gave rise to the red varieties of maize. This is why corn comes in so many colors, according to the old stories. Each hue reflects the touch of a different rain god, a different direction, a different type of nourishment for different seasons and purposes. The Tlaloc carried away their prizes to their mountain homes, to the peaks where they brewed storms and stored the moisture that would become rain. They placed the grain in great jars, each jar containing a different fate for any crop that depended upon it. From one jar might come gentle, nurturing rain that would make corn grow tall and strong. From another might come hail that would destroy a season's worth of labor in a single afternoon. This arrangement would shape the religious practices of Mesoamerica for millennia. The gods of rain became essential figures in every community's worship, for they held the power of life and death over every harvest. Farmers would offer sacrifices, perform rituals, and pray for the Tlalocs' favor, hoping that the jar chosen for their fields would be the beneficial one. But despite the rain god's acquisition of the grain, the outcome was not entirely negative for humanity. Yes, the food was now distributed according to divine whim rather than being freely available. But it was distributed. The Tlaloc carried the seeds to every corner of the world, scattering them across the landscape, ensuring that corn and beans and all the other crops would grow wherever humans settled. From the Caribbean islands to the high plateaus, from tropical lowlands to mountain valleys, the descendants of those first seeds would take root and flourish. The Tlaloc, in their desire to control, had actually ensured that no part of the world would be without sustenance. Their greed became a vehicle for abundance. Back in Tamoanchan, the humans who had tasted that first kernel of corn found that they were truly hungry now. The initial nourishment had awakened their appetites, and they needed more. But corn was now growing in the world, spreading from the broken mountain through the ministrations of the rain gods. Soon there would be harvests, and from those harvests would come the civilization that would transform Mesoamerica. Quetzalcoatl watched the Tlaloc disappear into the distance, carrying away the treasures he had worked so hard to locate. He might have felt frustrated or defeated, but instead he saw the larger pattern. The food was out of the mountain. It would reach the humans. The method of distribution was perhaps not ideal, but the end result served the purpose. And through it all, a single red ant had made the difference. Without Azcatl's guidance, none of this would have been possible. The mountain of sustenance would have remained sealed, its contents unknown, while humanity starved in the gardens of paradise. Now that we understand the story, let us pause to consider what it meant to the people who told it. Myths are never just stories. They are encoded wisdom, cultural values transformed into narrative form so that they can be passed from generation to generation. The tale of Azcatl contains layers of meaning that reveal how the Aztecs understood the world and their place within it. First, and most obviously, there is the symbolism of size. In a pantheon dominated by powerful gods who could create worlds and destroy civilizations, who could become suns and transform mountains, the key to human survival comes from one of the smallest creatures in existence. Azcatl is not mighty. In most versions of the story, the ant is not even particularly clever or exceptional among its kind. It simply possesses knowledge that the gods lack and is willing, eventually, to share that knowledge. This carries a profound message about the value of the seemingly insignificant. The Aztecs built a society that valued warriors and priests, emperors and nobles. But they also understood that the empire depended on the labor of millions of ordinary people, farmers and craftsmen and servants who did the daily work of keeping civilization running. The story of Azcatl honors these invisible contributors by showing that even the gods depend on humble workers. The ant's initial reluctance to share its secret also carries meaning. Azcatl does not immediately surrender its knowledge when confronted by Quetzalcoatl. It hesitates, resists, only yielding after sustained pressure from the god. This is not presented as stubbornness or malice, but as a kind of protective wisdom. The location of the mountain of sustenance was sacred, guarded, not to be revealed lightly. Azcatl understood that some knowledge carries responsibility, that sharing it changes everything. This reflects the Aztec understanding of how important information should be treated. Not everything should be freely available to everyone. Certain knowledge, certain secrets, should be protected until the right time and the right recipient appears. Azcatl judged that Quetzalcoatl was worthy, that the cause was sufficient, and only then opened the way to Tonacatepetl. The transformation of Quetzalcoatl into an ant is equally significant. One of the most powerful gods in the Mesoamerican pantheon humbles himself to take the form of an insect. He experiences the world from the ant's perspective, navigating tunnels that would be invisible to a deity in his true form, facing dangers that seem trivial from above but become overwhelming at ant scale. This transformation teaches that wisdom sometimes requires abandoning one's normal perspective. Quetzalcoatl could not access the mountain of sustenance as a god. Only by becoming small, by literally lowering himself, could he reach the food that would save humanity. The Aztec rulers who heard this story were reminded that even the highest positions come with limitations, and that sometimes solutions require approaching problems from entirely different angles. The ant colony itself served as a model for Aztec society. Ants are among the most organized creatures in the natural world, living in vast communities where each individual has a defined role. Workers gather food, soldiers defend the nest, queens produce the next generation. The colony functions as a single superorganism, with the good of the whole taking precedence over individual interests. The Aztecs observed this behavior with admiration. Their own society was rigidly hierarchical, with everyone from the emperor to the lowest slave having specific duties and expectations. The ant demonstrated that such organization was natural, even divine. When the myth portrayed Azcatl as the savior of humanity, it validated the importance of knowing one's place and fulfilling one's role. But there is something even deeper in the symbolism. Ants work underground, in darkness, building structures that most creatures never see. They move through the hidden places of the world, no paths that surface dwellers cannot imagine. In this sense, Azcatl represents connection to the underworld, to the realm beneath the earth where the dead dwell and where seeds germinate into new life. The mountain of sustenance is not on the surface. It is within the earth, accessible only through tunnels that wind through stone and darkness. Corn itself grows from seeds buried in soil, spending part of its life cycle underground before emerging into the light. The ant, as a creature of both surface and underground, serves as a natural mediator between these realms, guiding gods and grain between the worlds. The Aztecs performed rituals to honor ants, recognizing their importance in the mythological order. Ant hills were sometimes treated as sacred sites, places where the above and below connected. Disturbing an ant colony could bring bad luck, a reflection of the debt that humanity owed to Azcatl for revealing the location of their most fundamental sustenance. Modern scientists have discovered remarkable things about ant behavior that the Aztecs intuited thousands of years ago. Leafcutter ants, which are found throughout Mesoamerica, actually farm fungus, cultivating gardens underground with a sophistication that rivals human agriculture. These ants cut leaves and carry them to their nests, but they do not eat the leaves directly. Instead, they feed the leaves to a special fungus that they have domesticated, and the fungus in turn feeds the ants. This ant agriculture has been developing for at least 50 million years, long before humans existed. The Aztecs, watching leafcutter ants carry their leaf fragments in endless processions, may have sensed this connection between ant labor and the cultivation of food. The story of Azcatl perhaps reflects an intuitive understanding that ants possess secrets of sustenance that humans could learn from. The resilience of ants also resonated with Aztec values. These tiny creatures can lift many times their own body weight, endure conditions that would kill larger animals, and rebuild their colonies after devastating setbacks. Ant communities survive floods and fires, predators and pesticides, adapting and persisting through almost any challenge. For a people who believe they were living in a world destined for destruction, who performed sacrifices to stave off cosmic catastrophe, the ants' resilience offered hope. If such small creatures could survive so much, perhaps humanity too could endure. The fifth sun might be destined to end in earthquakes, as the prophets foretold, but that did not mean human effort was meaningless. Like the ant, one could work and build and prepare, doing everything possible to sustain life even in the face of inevitable doom. The specific identification of Azcatl as a red ant carries its own significance. Red is the color of blood, the substance that the gods themselves used to create humanity. It is the color of sacrifice, of life force, of the bond between gods and mortals. A red ant carrying the grain that would save humanity reinforces the connection between sustenance and sacrifice, between food and blood. In some versions of the myth, Azcatl is described as enormous, larger than 3 jaguars. This gigantic portrayal seems to contradict the emphasis on humility and smallness, but it actually serves a different purpose. It emphasizes that the ordinary contains the extraordinary. The same creature that you might see crawling across your floor possesses, in its mythological form, power and majesty that exceed even the greatest predators. Never underestimate the small, the story tells us. Never dismiss the common as unimportant. The Aztecs were not alone in recognizing the mythological significance of ants. Cultures around the world, separated by oceans and millennia, have woven these remarkable creatures into their sacred narratives. The universality of ant symbolism suggests that something fundamental about these insects resonates with human consciousness, something that transcends specific cultural contexts. Let us travel from Mesoamerica to the arid lands of the American Southwest, where the Hopi people tell their own story of ants and survival. According to Hopi tradition, the world has been destroyed multiple times, much like in Aztec cosmology. When the first world ended in fire, the Hopi faced annihilation, but they were saved by the ant people. These beings, neither fully human nor fully insect, took the Hopi underground to their vast tunnel systems. There, in the darkness beneath the burning world, the ant people sheltered the humans, fed them, and taught them essential survival skills. The Hopi learned to build dwellings into rock, to grow food with minimal water, to understand the stars and mathematics. When the surface world finally became habitable again, the ant people guided the Hopi back up, and the knowledge they had gained underground enabled them to thrive in the harsh desert environment. The parallels to the Azcatl story are striking. In both traditions, ants possess secret knowledge that saves humanity. In both, the underground realm contains sustenance and wisdom. In both, these tiny creatures are honored as benefactors whose contributions shaped the course of human civilization. Some researchers have noted that Hopi petroglyphs depicting the ant people bear a curious resemblance to modern artistic interpretations of extraterrestrial beings, leading to some rather fanciful theories. But the more grounded interpretation is simply that the Hopi, like the Aztecs, observed ants with careful attention and recognized them as masters of survival in extreme environments. What better teachers could there be for people trying to flourish in the unforgiving desert? Far across the world, in ancient Greece, ants featured in one of mythology's most dramatic transformation stories. The island of Aegina had been devastated by a terrible plague that killed nearly all its inhabitants. King Aeacus, son of Zeus, watched his people die and his kingdom crumble. In desperation, he called upon his divine father to restore his population. Zeus heard his son's prayer and looked down at the island. He saw ants moving across the bark of a sacred oak tree, industrious and countless, and he had his solution. With a wave of divine power, he transformed the ants into human warriors. These new people were called the Myrmidons, from the Greek word myrmex, meaning ant. The Myrmidons became legendary for their discipline and ferocity in battle. They fought with the organized efficiency of an ant colony, each warrior knowing his place, the whole army moving as a single coordinated organism. Most famously, the Myrmidons served under Achilles in the Trojan War, their ant-derived nature making them some of the most feared soldiers in the Greek forces. This myth carries different emphases than the Aztec story. Where Azcatl represents wisdom and sustenance, the Greek ants represent military might and regeneration of a population. But both share the core recognition that ants possess something valuable, something worth emulating, something that can benefit humanity in times of crisis. The Greeks also told of the Myrmex indikoi, the giant ants of India. Herodotus, that great collector of stories from distant lands, reported that in the deserts of the Far East lived ants the size of foxes or dogs that dug gold from the sandy earth. Local tribes would venture out on camels during the hottest parts of the day, when the giant ants hid underground, to steal the gold dust they brought to the surface. These ants were incredibly fast, faster than any land animal, and the raiders had to employ clever strategies to escape with their treasure. They would harness 3 camels together, placing a female who had recently given birth in the center, knowing that her desire to return to her offspring would drive her to run faster than the pursuing ants could follow. Modern scholars have suggested that these giant ants may have been marmots, whose digging does indeed bring mineral-rich soil to the surface in certain Himalayan regions. The Persian words for marmot and mountain ant are similar enough that a translation error could easily have occurred. But whether the story describes actual marmots or purely mythological creatures, it demonstrates the widespread association of ants with hidden wealth beneath the earth, with treasures accessible only to those who understand ant ways. African traditions also give ants significant roles. Among the Kuba people of Central Africa, a creation myth describes how ants helped spread the earth at the beginning of time, carrying tiny grains of soil to build the dry land upon which humans would eventually live. This puts ants at the very foundation of the world, original architects whose work made all subsequent creation possible. Throughout various African cultures, termites, often called white ants despite being biologically distinct, and their remarkable mounds feature in stories about community, industry, and the connection between seen and unseen worlds. Termite mounds, which can tower several meters high, are sometimes viewed as sacred sites, places where the underground spirits can communicate with the surface world. In Hindu and Buddhist traditions, ants appear in teachings about karma and the interconnectedness of all beings. The concept of ahimsa, or non-harm, extends even to the smallest creatures, with some devoted practitioners sweeping the ground before them to avoid accidentally killing ants. Stories are told of spiritual masters who demonstrated their enlightenment by their compassion toward insects, recognizing the same spark of consciousness in an ant as in any other being. The Chinese character for ant combines the symbols for insect and righteousness, suggesting an association between these creatures and proper moral conduct. This linguistic connection reflects the observation that ants seem to embody certain virtues: diligence, cooperation, sacrifice for the greater good. What unites all these diverse traditions? Why do cultures from completely different parts of the world, with no direct contact with one another, all arrive at similar conclusions about the symbolic importance of ants? The answer likely lies in the observable behavior of these creatures. Everywhere that humans live, ants live too. People watch ants from childhood, observing their tireless labor, their organized colonies, their ability to accomplish feats far beyond what any individual ant could achieve alone. Ants demonstrate fundamental truths about cooperation and community that are immediately relevant to human society. Moreover, ants are liminal creatures, moving between worlds. They live underground but emerge to the surface. They build structures that span both realms. They possess knowledge of hidden places, secret paths, resources invisible to those who only see what is above the ground. In a spiritual sense, they are natural candidates for the role of messenger or guide between the world we see and the one that lies beneath. The specific story of Azcatl, with its emphasis on corn and sustenance, reflects the particular concerns of Mesoamerican agricultural civilization. But the broader archetype it embodies, the small creature with great wisdom, the humble worker who saves the mighty, the guide to hidden treasures, this archetype appears again and again across human cultures because it speaks to something universal about our condition. We are all, in some sense, ants. We work at tasks whose ultimate purpose we may not fully understand, contributing our small part to a larger project that exceeds any individual lifetime. We depend on cooperation to survive, on the willingness of others to share knowledge and resources, and we all hope that our labor, humble though it may seem, might somehow make a difference, might contribute to something larger than ourselves. The myth of Azcatl tells us that such hope is justified. The smallest creature can carry the seed that saves the world. To fully appreciate what Azcatl's discovery meant to the peoples of Mesoamerica, we must understand the unique place that corn holds in their cultures. This is not simply a matter of economics or nutrition, though corn was certainly vital on both counts. The relationship between Mesoamerican peoples and maize is better understood as a sacred bond, a deep interdependence that shaped religion, philosophy, art, and identity itself. Consider first the remarkable fact that corn cannot exist without human intervention. Unlike other staple crops that can survive and spread in the wild, domesticated maize is completely dependent on farmers. Its seeds are wrapped tightly in a husk that prevents natural dispersal. Left to itself, a corn cob would fall to the ground and rot, the kernels unable to escape to become new plants. Every ear of corn that grows, anywhere in the world, represents an unbroken chain of human cultivation stretching back 9,000 years or more to the first farmers who recognized potential in a wild grass called teosinte. This mutual dependence creates a bond unlike any other in agriculture. Humans need corn to survive. Corn needs humans to exist. The Mesoamerican peoples understood this relationship as sacred, a covenant between species, a marriage of fates. The Popol Vuh, the creation story of the Kitsch Maya, tells explicitly that humans are made from corn. After failed attempts to create people from mud and then from wood, the gods finally fashioned successful humans using maize. The flesh of humanity is literally corn dough, transformed by divine power, but never losing its essential nature. When you eat tortillas, according to this understanding, you are consuming the same substance that forms your own body. The boundaries between food and self, between nourisher and nourished, dissolve in this intimate exchange. Aztec traditions carry similar themes. While the Aztec creation myth emphasizes the bone-and-blood origins of humanity, the role of corn in completing and sustaining that creation is equally central. The first humans, fashioned in Tamoanchan, could not truly live until they tasted maize. The corn activated them, gave them the energy to move and think and grow. Without Azcatl's revelation, without the splitting of Tenochtitlan, those first people would have remained incomplete, dying even as they breathed. The gods associated with corn in Mesoamerican tradition are legion. Cenotl was the principal maize god of the Aztecs. often depicted as a young man wearing corn husks, his very body representing the plant that sustained the empire. Chicamcotl was the goddess of mature corn, of the harvest, honored with festivals when the grain was gathered. Xilanen presided over young corn, the tender ears that promised future abundance. Each stage of the corn's life cycle had its divine patron, reflecting how intimately the plant's growth was woven into the sacred calendar. The agricultural cycle itself was a religious ritual. Planting was not merely a practical act, but a ceremonial one, accompanied by prayers and offerings to ensure the favor of the rain gods and the corn deities. Growing corn required coordinating with cosmic forces, reading the stars and the seasons, understanding when Tlaloc would send his rains and when the Tlaloc would withhold them. A successful harvest was evidence of harmony between humans and gods, between earth and sky. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found a civilization that had been built on corn for millennia. The great cities of the Aztec Empire, the monumental pyramids, the sophisticated artwork, the complex religious systems, all of this rested on a foundation of maize agriculture. The surplus produced by corn farmers fed the artisans, priests, warriors, and rulers who created what we now recognize as one of the world's great civilizations. The Aztecs developed a process called nixtamalization that transformed raw corn into a superior food. By soaking and cooking maize in a solution of lime water, they unlocked nutrients that would otherwise be unavailable, dramatically increasing the grain's nutritional value. This technique may have been essential to the rise of complex civilization in Mesoamerica, providing the caloric and nutritional foundation necessary to support large urban populations. Corn was not just eaten, it was woven into virtually every aspect of life. The stalks could be used for construction, the husks for wrapping food and making crafts, the cobs burned for fuel. Corn-based beverages ranged from simple atoll to fermented chicha, consumed in both everyday and ceremonial contexts. Even the hair-like silk that surrounds the cob had its uses, sometimes in medicine, sometimes in rituals. The colors of corn carried their own meanings, as we saw in the story of the Tlaloc. White corn was associated with the north and with purity. Yellow corn, the most common, represented the sun and abundance. Blue and black corn had special sacred significance, used in particular ceremonies and valued for their connection to the night sky and the underworld. Red corn evoked blood and sacrifice, the substances that kept the cosmic order functioning. All of this context helps us understand why the myth of Azcatl resonated so deeply with the peoples of Mesoamerica. The ant was not revealing the location of just any food. It was pointing the way to the very substance of life, the plant that made civilization possible, the crop that connected humans to the divine. Azcatl's knowledge was sacred knowledge, and its sharing was an act of cosmic significance. Today, corn remains central to Mexican culture and cuisine. Tortillas, tamales, pozole, enchiladas, and countless other dishes continue traditions that stretch back to the time of Azcatl. When a grandmother grinds corn on a metate, she is performing essentially the same action that Cihuacotl performed on the bones of humanity, transforming raw material into the stuff of life. The continuity is unbroken, the relationship ongoing. Modern agricultural science has confirmed what the ancient peoples knew intuitively. Corn is one of the most efficient food crops ever developed, capable of producing more calories per acre than almost any other plant. It has been adapted to grow in climates ranging from tropical lowlands to high mountain valleys, from humid jungles to semi-arid plateaus. The genetic diversity preserved in traditional varieties represents an irreplaceable heritage, a living library of agricultural wisdom accumulated over millennia. And all of it, according to the old stories, began with a red ant and a single kernel of golden grain. There is another strand of the Azcatl legend that deserves our attention, one that casts the giant ant in a different role. In some Nahuatl traditions, Azcatl appears not just as a guide to hidden food, but as a defender of the ancestral homeland, a protector of the mythical place from which the Aztec people originally came. This homeland was called Aztlan, meaning place of the herons or place of whiteness. It is the origin of the word Aztec, describing the people who came from this legendary location. According to the migration stories, Aztlan was an island paradise somewhere to the north of the Valley of Mexico, a prosperous place where the ancestors of the Mexica lived before embarking on their long journey southward. The descriptions of Aztlan vary. Some accounts present it as a utopia, a land of abundance where the people lived in harmony with the gods. Others describe a more troubled place, where the ancestors were subject to a tyrannical elite and eventually fled to seek freedom. The god Huitzilopochtli, appearing to the leaders of the people, commanded them to leave Aztlan and search for a new home. He forbade them to use the name Azteca anymore, instructing them to call themselves Mexica instead. The journey from Aztlan to the Valley of Mexico took many generations and involved numerous stops along the way. The Mexica carried with them the image of Huitzilopochtli, consulting the god for guidance at crucial moments. Finally, they received the sign they had been promised, an eagle perched on a cactus, devouring a snake. This vision appeared on an island in Lake Texcoco, and there the Mexica founded their great city of Tenochtitlan, which would become the heart of the Aztec Empire. But what does any of this have to do with Azcatl? In some versions of the legend, particularly those recorded in sources like a pre-Columbian bestiary by Elon Stavins and Eco, Azcatl is described as a creature created specifically to defend Aztlan. This ant is enormous, the size of 3 jaguars combined, with a body that consists of hypnotic curves capable of entrancing any enemy that gazes upon it. Far from being a humble guide, this Azcatl is a guardian, a protector of the ancestral homeland against any who would threaten it. This version of Azcatl adds complexity to the creature's mythology. The ant is not only associated with sustenance and survival, but also with protection and territorial defense. It guards the place of origin, the mythical source from which the Aztec people derive their identity. Even after the Mexica left Aztlan for their destined homeland, the giant ant remained behind, ensuring that the ancestral paradise would endure. There are interesting connections here to the Aztec understanding of history and identity. The people of Tenochtitlan never forgot that they came from somewhere else. They maintained stories of their migration, preserved knowledge of their origins, and occasionally even sent expeditions to try to locate the legendary Aztlan. The Emperor Moctezuma I reportedly organized such an expedition, seeking to reconnect with the ancestral homeland and perhaps to recover sacred knowledge that had been left behind. The giant ant of Aztlan represents the preservation of that ancestral connection. Even separated from their place of origin by hundreds of miles and many generations, the Mexica could imagine Azcatl standing guard, maintaining the integrity of Aztlan, ensuring that the mythical homeland remained intact for any who might one day return. This guardian role connects to the broader ant symbolism we have explored. Ants are territorial creatures, fiercely defending their colonies against intruders. They will sacrifice individual lives without hesitation to protect the nest. The image of Azcatl defending Aztlan draws on this observed behavior, magnifying it to mythic proportions. The hypnotic curves of the giant ant's body are a fascinating detail. They suggest a creature that defeats enemies not through brute force, but through psychological power, the ability to paralyze and confuse those who approach with hostile intent. This is a sophisticated form of defense, one that values cunning over strength, that protects through confusion rather than destruction. Perhaps there is a metaphor here for the protective power of culture itself. The traditions and stories that the Mexica carried with them from Aztlan served as a kind of psychological defense, a source of identity and cohesion that bound them together through the hardships of migration and the challenges of building a new civilization. Like Azcatl's hypnotic curves, these cultural treasures disoriented enemies by presenting a people unified in purpose and confident in their destiny. The location of Aztlan remains one of the great mysteries of Mesoamerican studies. Various scholars have proposed sites ranging from northwestern Mexico to the American Southwest. Some have suggested that Aztlan may have been purely mythical, a legendary paradise rather than an actual geographic location. Others argue that it represents a real place, perhaps somewhere in the states of Nayarit or Utah, whose exact position has been obscured by centuries of storytelling. Regardless of whether Aztlan ever existed as a physical place, its importance as a mythological concept is undeniable. It provided the Aztec people with a sense of origin, a connection to a past that predated their settlement in the Valley of Mexico. And Azcatl, in his role as defender of that origin, ensured that the ancestral homeland remained sacred and inviolable in cultural memory. As our journey through the world of Azcatl draws to a close, let us reflect on what this ancient story has to offer us today. The Aztec Empire fell to Spanish conquest over 500 years ago, but the myths that sustained its people have proven more durable than any stone temple or golden treasure. They have been preserved in colonial-era codices, in the work of missionary scholars who recorded what they could before it was lost, in the oral traditions of communities that never forgot their roots. The story of Azcatl endures because it speaks to truths that transcend its specific cultural context. It tells us that wisdom can come from unexpected sources, that the humblest creature may possess knowledge essential to survival. In an age when we are increasingly aware of how much we still do not understand about the natural world, this message resonates with renewed force. Consider the leafcutter ants of tropical America, direct relatives of the ants the Aztecs would have observed. These remarkable creatures have been practicing agriculture for 50 million years, farming fungus in underground gardens long before the first human ever planted a seed. Their colonies can contain millions of individuals, each with a specific role, working together to maintain a system more complex than many human cities. Modern scientists are studying ant colonies to learn about efficient organization, sustainable agriculture, and collective problem solving. The insights gained might help us design better systems for everything from traffic flow to computer networks. In a very real sense, we are still learning from ants, still discovering secrets they have guarded since long before humanity existed. The ecological role of ants is equally remarkable. They are among the most important organisms in many ecosystems, aerating soil, dispersing seeds, controlling pest populations, and recycling nutrients. It has been estimated that ants turn over more soil than earthworms in many environments, their endless tunneling bringing air and water to the roots of plants. Without ants, the world would be a very different place, and probably a less hospitable one for humans. The Aztecs, with their careful observation of the natural world, sensed these connections without being able to articulate them in modern scientific terms. They encoded their understanding in myth, creating stories that honored the ants' importance and reminded each new generation to pay attention to even the smallest creatures. There is something poignant about the image of the mighty god Quetzalcoatl transformed into an ant, following Azcatl through dark tunnels to discover the hidden food that would save humanity. It suggests that power alone is not enough, that wisdom requires humility, that sometimes the only way forward is to make oneself small and learn from those who know the secret paths. This lesson seems particularly relevant in our current moment. Humanity has achieved power beyond anything the Aztecs could have imagined. We have split the atom, walked on the moon, decoded the genome. And yet we find ourselves facing challenges that seem beyond our ability to solve. Climate change, biodiversity loss, the potential for civilizational collapse from our own technological hubris. Perhaps, like Quetzalcoatl, we need to transform ourselves to adopt perspectives very different from our usual ones. Perhaps the solutions to our greatest challenges will come not from more power, but from more attention to the small, the overlooked, the creatures and systems that we have dismissed as unimportant. The ant still has secrets to share. The corn that Azcatl revealed remains central to human civilization. Maize is now the most widely grown crop in the world, surpassing even rice and wheat. It feeds billions of people, both directly and through the animals that consume it. The genetic diversity of traditional corn varieties, preserved by indigenous communities throughout the Americas, represents an invaluable resource for future food security. But this same corn is also at the center of controversies about industrial agriculture, genetic modification, and the sustainability of our food system. The relationship between humans and maize that the Aztecs understood as sacred has been complicated by modern economics and technology. We might do well to remember the original bargain, the understanding that corn and people depend on each other, that sustenance involves mutual obligation rather than simple extraction. The rain gods, the Tlaloc, who carried away the grain from Tonacatepetl, remind us that access to food has always been shaped by forces beyond individual control. Drought and flood, those ancient enemies, continue to threaten harvests around the world. Climate change is making weather patterns less predictable, more extreme, more dangerous. The jars of the rain gods are being scrambled in ways that human civilization has never experienced. And yet the story also offers hope. The humans in Tamoanshan were dying, but they were saved. The mountain was sealed, but it was opened. The food seemed lost, but it spread across the world. Even the Tlaloc's acquisition of the grain, which might have seemed like defeat, became the means by which sustenance reached every corner of the earth. So let us carry with us, as we conclude this exploration, the image of a small red ant emerging from the shadows. It carries a single kernel of corn, golden as captured sunlight, precious beyond all measure. A god notices. Questions are asked. A journey begins. And because of that tiny creature and its willingness to share what it knew, we are here, all of us, children of corn, descendants of those first humans who tasted maize in the gardens of paradise. The next time you see an ant crossing your path, carrying some fragment of food toward its distant nest, consider pausing for just a moment. Remember Azcatl. Remember that the smallest creatures can carry the greatest secrets. Remember that humility and persistence, day after day, can move mountains. And remember that somewhere, perhaps, in a mythical homeland far to the north, a giant red ant still stands guard, its hypnotic curves ready to confuse any enemy, protecting the place from which we all, in some spiritual sense, began. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Aztec mythology and the remarkable legend of Azcatl, the giant ant. If you found this exploration meaningful, if these ancient stories stirred something in your imagination, I hope you will consider subscribing to this channel. We have many more journeys ahead of us, many more myths to explore, many more secrets to uncover from cultures around the world and across the ages. Hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and join me next time as we continue to explore the vast and wondrous world of mythology and folklore. Until then, may you walk with the wisdom of Azcatl, may you find the sustenance you seek, and may you never underestimate the power of small things to change the world. Sweet dreams. Before we move toward our conclusion, let us pause to marvel at what modern science has revealed about the creatures the Aztecs honored in their mythology. Because the more we learn about actual ants, the more prescient the ancient wisdom seems, and the more we understand why Azcatl occupied such an important place in the Mesoamerican imagination. Ants are among the most successful organisms on the planet. They have colonized every continent except Antarctica, adapting to environments ranging from tropical rainforests to scorching deserts to frozen tundras. There are more than 12,000 described species of ants, with estimates suggesting many thousands more remain undiscovered. By sheer biomass, ants may account for 15 to 20% of all terrestrial animal life. If you could somehow gather all the ants on Earth and weigh them, they would outweigh all of humanity combined. This extraordinary success stems from qualities that the Aztecs recognized and honored: cooperation, division of labor, persistence, and the willingness to sacrifice individual interests for the good of the colony. An ant by itself is a small and fairly helpless creature. But an ant colony is something else entirely, a superorganism that can accomplish feats beyond any individual's capability. Consider the logistics alone. A single leafcutter ant colony might contain 8 million individuals, all of whom need to be fed, organized, and coordinated. Information must flow constantly through the colony, directing workers to food sources, alerting soldiers to threats, guiding the queen's attendants in their endless care of her needs. This communication happens primarily through pheromones, chemical signals that can convey remarkably complex information. When a forager finds a promising food source, she returns to the nest, leaving a trail of pheromones behind her. Other workers follow this trail, and if they too find the food worthwhile, they reinforce the trail on their return journey. If the food source is depleted or of poor quality, the pheromone trail gradually fades, and workers turn their attention elsewhere. This elegant system allows colonies to efficiently allocate their workforce without any central planning or conscious decision-making. The Aztecs, watching ant trails form and dissolve, watching columns of workers appear seemingly from nowhere to exploit a fallen fruit or dead insect, must have marveled at the coordination involved. They could not have known about pheromones, but they could observe the results. Thousands of individuals acting as one, pursuing goals that serve the colony as a whole. The division of labor in ant colonies is sophisticated beyond anything else in the insect world. In leafcutter colonies, there are distinct castes of workers sized for different tasks. The smallest workers, called minims, tend the fungus gardens and care for the brood. Slightly larger miners patrol the foraging trails, protecting their sisters from predators. Medii do the actual cutting and carrying of leaves. And the largest workers, the majors or soldiers, defend the nest against large threats, their powerful mandibles capable of drawing blood from any creature foolish enough to attack. This specialization allows the colony to be remarkably efficient. Each ant does what she is best suited for, no energy wasted on tasks that others can perform better. The Aztec society, with its own rigid hierarchies and specialized roles, saw in the ant colony a natural model for their social organization. Warriors, priests, farmers, artisans, each had their place, and the empire functioned when everyone fulfilled their designated purpose. But perhaps most remarkable is the ants' relationship with agriculture. Leafcutter ants are farmers, cultivating fungus gardens that they depend on for food. They do not eat the leaves they cut. Instead, they feed the leaves to their domesticated fungus, which in turn produces nutritious growths that the ants consume. This symbiotic relationship has been developing for at least 50 million years, making ant agriculture far older than human agriculture. The ants are meticulous farmers. They weed their gardens, removing any fungal growth that does not belong. They apply antibiotics produced by bacteria living on their bodies to protect their crop from parasites. They monitor the temperature and humidity of their chambers, adjusting conditions to optimize fungal growth. When a new queen sets out to found a colony, she carries a piece of the fungus garden with her, a starter culture for the gardens of her new realm. The parallels to human agriculture are uncanny. We too cultivate crops that we depend on for survival. We too protect our fields from pests and weeds. We too have developed specialized knowledge passed down through generations. The Aztecs, watching leafcutter columns carrying their leaf fragments along cleared highways stretching dozens of meters from the nest, were watching fellow farmers, fellow cultivators, fellow beings who had mastered the art of growing food. Perhaps it is no coincidence that the myth of Azcatl involves the discovery of agricultural sustenance. The ants who guided Quetzalcoatl to Tenochtitlan were not random creatures, but the natural experts in the production and storage of food. Who better to know where the world's grain was hidden than beings who had been farming underground for tens of millions of years? The storage practices of ants are equally impressive. Harvester ants collect seeds during times of abundance and store them in underground chambers, creating reserves that sustain the colony through seasons of scarcity. These seed caches can be enormous, containing enough food to feed thousands of ants for months. The ants are careful about storage conditions, moving seeds to different chambers depending on moisture levels, discarding any that begin to sprout or show signs of mold. This hoarding behavior, so visible in ant colonies, mirrors the mythological mountain of sustenance. Tenochtitlan, with its vast chambers filled with grain of every kind, is essentially an idealized version of the ant's larder, the storage system that allows the colony to survive unpredictable conditions. The Aztecs may have imagined their cosmos through the lens of ant behavior, understanding the divine order as a scaled-up version of the natural order they observed in gardens and fields. The underground realm of the ants was particularly significant. Most of the colony's activity occurs beneath the surface, invisible to casual observation. The elaborate tunnel systems, the carefully constructed chambers, the complex architecture that maintains airflow and manages waste, all of this exists hidden from the world above. To know the secrets of the ants, one must be willing to dig, to enter the underground, to see as the ants see. Quetzalcoatl's transformation into an ant was necessary precisely because the treasures he sought were underground, accessible only through passages too small for gods in their normal forms. This journey into darkness, through confined spaces, following guides who know paths invisible to the uninitiated, resonates with shamanic traditions worldwide. The shaman enters altered states to access hidden realms. Quetzalcoatl entered the body of an ant to access the hidden mountain. Both journeys require leaving the ordinary self behind. The ants of Mesoamerica include some remarkable species. The army ants, for instance, are nomadic predators that sweep through the forest in vast columns, devouring everything in their path. They do not maintain permanent nests, but instead form temporary bivouacs from their own bodies, the workers linking together to create living walls and chambers. When it is time to move, the entire colony advances in a seething mass, carrying the queen and brood at the center. These army ants were surely known to the Aztecs, and they may have contributed to the image of Azcatl as a formidable creature. An individual army ant is small, but a colony on the march is terrifying, capable of overwhelming animals much larger than themselves through sheer numbers and persistence. The hypnotic curves attributed to the giant Azcatl of Aslan might reference the disorienting effect of watching army ant columns, the way the eye struggles to track individual ants within the seething mass. Fire ants, another Mesoamerican species, are famous for their painful stings. Their colonies can contain hundreds of thousands of workers, and they respond to threats with coordinated aggression. Step on a fire ant mound, and within seconds you will be covered with stinging ants, all of them biting and injecting venom simultaneously. This defensive ferocity reinforces the image of ants as guardians, creatures that protect their territory with fearsome determination. The identification of Azcatl as a red ant takes on additional significance when we consider the fire ant's coloration and temperament. Red ants are not passive creatures, but active defenders of their domain. The giant Azcatl who guards Aslan is not merely watching. It is ready to fight, ready to repel any who would threaten the ancestral homeland. Even the simple observation that ants can carry loads many times their own body weight must have impressed ancient observers. This strength, disproportionate to their size, suggested a form of power that transcended physical dimensions. The small could be mighty, the humble could be strong. These lessons, writ large in ant behavior, found their way into myth and moral teaching. The story of Azcatl illuminates a fundamental aspect of Aztec theology that often puzzles modern observers. The idea that gods depend on smaller beings, that the cosmic order requires contributions from creatures across the hierarchy of existence. In many religious traditions, the divine is presented as wholly self-sufficient, needing nothing from creation. The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob does not require human assistance to maintain the universe. The Brahman of Hindu philosophy is complete in itself, lacking nothing. Even the gods of Olympus, though they interact with mortals, could presumably exist without them. But Aztec theology presents a different picture. The gods are powerful, certainly, but they are not self-sufficient. They need blood to function. They need sacrifice to maintain the cosmic order. And as the Azcatl myth reveals, they sometimes need the knowledge of creatures far beneath them in the divine hierarchy. Quetzalcoatl, one of the most important gods in the Mesoamerican pantheon, could not solve the problem of feeding humanity on his own. Despite his wisdom, despite his power, despite his role as creator and culture bringer, he lacked a crucial piece of information. He did not know where the food was hidden. He needed Azcatl. This dependency is remarkable when you consider it. The feathered serpent, who had descended to the underworld and retrieved the bones of the dead, who had shed his own blood to create humanity, who would transform into the wind and the morning star. This mighty deity was stumped by a question that a small insect could answer. The theological implications are profound. If even the gods have limits, if even divine beings need help from unexpected sources, then the cosmos is a collaborative enterprise. Every being has a role to play, a contribution to make, a piece of the puzzle that only they can provide. The lowliest creature might possess the knowledge that saves the world. This understanding would have shaped how the Aztecs viewed their own society. If the gods themselves were interdependent, how much more so were mortals? The farmer who grew corn was not performing a task inferior to the priest who offered sacrifices. Both were essential to the maintenance of the cosmic order. The warrior who captured prisoners for sacrifice was not more important than the artisan who crafted the tools of ceremony. Each served necessary functions. Moreover, this theology created obligations that flowed in multiple directions. Humans owed sacrifice to the gods, yes, but the gods also owed sustenance to humans. The bargain went both ways. When Quetzalcoatl sought out corn for his creations, he was fulfilling a divine obligation, not bestowing an unearned gift. The humans had been created, they deserved to be fed. The gods had to find a way. The involvement of the rain gods in distributing the grain further illustrates this interdependence. The Tlaloc did not create the corn. They merely acquired control over its distribution. Their power was derivative, dependent on the prior existence of the grain that Azcatl had revealed. And their use of that power was not arbitrary. It served the larger purpose of spreading sustenance across the world. Even the Tlalocs' seemingly greedy acquisition of the grain from Tonacatepetl can be read as part of the cosmic order. Yes, they took the food from the mountain, but in doing so, they ensured that it would be distributed according to patterns of rain and season, integrated into the natural cycles that made agriculture possible. Had the gods simply taken the grain and given it directly to humans, there would have been no framework for its ongoing production. The Tlaloc, by controlling rain, created the conditions under which corn could continue to grow year after year. This systemic view of divinity, where gods are less sovereign rulers than essential components of a larger mechanism, aligns with the Aztec understanding of the cosmos as a fragile balance constantly in danger of collapse. The fifth sun could end at any time. Earthquakes were prophesied to eventually destroy the current age. Maintaining the world required constant effort from all participants, divine and mortal alike. Sacrifice makes more sense in this context. If the gods need blood to function, if the sun will stop moving without offerings, then sacrifice is not arbitrary cruelty, but essential maintenance. It is like maintaining a machine, providing the fuel that keeps everything running. The terrible aspects of Aztec religion that so horrified the Spanish become, from this perspective, expressions of desperate responsibility. The priests who tore hearts from living bodies believed they were preventing cosmic catastrophe. And Azcatl, the humble ant who knew where the food was hidden, becomes a figure of unexpected importance in this cosmic machinery. Without the ant's knowledge, the gods would have failed, humanity would have died, and the entire project of the fifth sun would have ended before it truly began. A tiny creature's contribution was essential to the survival of the cosmos. The story of Azcatl did not die with the Aztec Empire. It persisted through the colonial period, preserved in the memories of communities that maintained their traditional beliefs even as they adopted the outward forms of Christianity. And it continues to resonate today in ways both obvious and subtle. Contemporary Mexican culture maintains a deep connection to corn that the myth of Azcatl helps illuminate. The tortilla, that simple disc of nixtamalized corn, is not just a food but a cultural artifact, a connection to ancestors stretching back thousands of years. When Mexican families sit down to meals featuring corn in its many forms, they participate in a tradition that began when Azcatl first showed Quetzalcoatl the way to Tonacatepetl. The reverence for corn has taken on new dimensions in recent decades as concerns about genetically modified organisms and industrial agriculture have grown. Indigenous communities throughout Mexico have worked to preserve traditional corn varieties, the landrace crops that represent thousands of years of careful selection and cultivation. These heirloom varieties carry genetic diversity that may prove crucial for future food security, and their preservation is both an agricultural practice and a cultural statement. Organizations dedicated to protecting traditional Mexican corn explicitly connect their work to the ancient relationship between humans and maize. They speak of corn as more than a commodity, describing it in terms that echo the old myths. Corn as sacred, corn as essential to identity, corn as a gift that must be honored and protected. The spirit of Azcatl lives on in these efforts, in the understanding that the discovery and sharing of sustenance carries profound responsibilities. The Day of the Dead celebrations, which occur each November throughout Mexico, contain echoes of the Aztec understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead. Families create altars featuring foods beloved by their deceased relatives, including corn-based dishes like tamales and atole. These offerings acknowledge that the dead need sustenance, that the bonds between generations extend beyond physical death. The imagery of the ant has not disappeared from Mexican consciousness either. Indigenous communities in various regions maintain traditions that honor ants, recognizing their importance in the ecological and spiritual order. Among the Oatem people of northern Mexico and the American Southwest, ants are considered among the first creatures placed on Earth, worthy of respect and careful treatment. Disturbing an ant colony without proper acknowledgement is considered disrespectful, a violation of the relationship between humans and the natural world. Even in urban Mexico, where traditional beliefs have mixed with Catholicism, modernization, and globalization, certain attitudes persist. The willingness to work hard, to contribute to the community, to value collective effort over individual glory. These values that the ant embodies continue to shape Mexican culture. The myth of Azcatl, even when not explicitly remembered, has left its mark on how people understand their obligations to one another. The Aztec calendar, though no longer used for its original purposes, remains a powerful symbol of Mexican heritage. The massive sunstone discovered in the main plaza of Mexico City in 1790 depicts the 5 suns and the forces that destroyed each age. It stands as a reminder that the people who created it possessed sophisticated astronomical knowledge, complex theology, and a worldview that encompassed both cosmic grandeur and attention to small creatures like the ant. As we approach the end of our exploration, let us gather the threads of meaning that the myth of Azcatl weaves together. This story, told thousands of years ago in a civilization that has since passed from the world, still has much to teach those who are willing to listen. First, there is the lesson of unexpected sources. Wisdom does not always come from the powerful or the obvious. Sometimes the answer to our most pressing problems lies with those we have overlooked, in places we have not thought to look. Quetzalcoatl was a god, but he needed an ant to save humanity. How often do we dismiss potential solutions because they come from sources we consider beneath our attention? The modern world faces challenges that seem overwhelming. Climate change, biodiversity loss, social fragmentation, the threat of technologies we barely understand. Perhaps the solutions to these problems lie not in the halls of power or the laboratories of the elite, but in the traditional knowledge of indigenous peoples, the observations of farmers and fishermen, the wisdom of communities that have sustained themselves for generations without the resources we take for granted. Second, there is the lesson of transformation. Quetzalcoatl had to become an ant to access the mountain of sustenance. He had to abandon his divine form, his accustomed perspective, his normal way of moving through the world. Only by becoming small could he reach what he sought. We too must sometimes transform ourselves to solve problems. We must be willing to see from different perspectives, to adopt unfamiliar modes of thinking, to humble ourselves before those who know paths we cannot imagine. The expertise we have accumulated may be precisely what prevents us from finding solutions. Sometimes we need to become beginners again, followers rather than leaders, students of those we thought we were teaching. Third, there is the lesson of interconnection. The Aztec cosmos was a web of relationships, with every being dependent on others for survival. Gods needed mortals, mortals needed gods, and both needed creatures like Azcatl who bridged the realms. This understanding of mutual dependence seems particularly relevant in an age when ecological science reveals just how interconnected Earth's systems truly are. The corn that Azcatl revealed did not grow by itself. It required rain from the Tlaloc, soil from the Earth Goddess, sunlight from Nana Watson, and human cultivation to flourish. Each harvest was a collaboration involving countless participants, seen and unseen. When we forget this interconnection, when we treat the natural world as a resource to be exploited rather than a partner in existence, we endanger the web that sustains us all. Fourth, there is the lesson of persistence. Azcatl did not reveal its secret immediately. Quetzalcoatl had to persist in his questioning, had to convince the ant that the cause was worthy, that the knowledge would be used well. The mountain did not yield easily. Divine efforts were required to crack it open. The food, once released, was dispersed across the world, requiring ongoing effort to cultivate and harvest. Nothing worthwhile comes without sustained effort. The quick fix, the easy answer, the shortcut to success, these are usually illusions. Real achievement requires the patient labor of the ant, the day-after-day commitment to building something larger than oneself. The myth reminds us that even the gods must work for what they want. Fifth, there is the lesson of community. Ants do not succeed as individuals. Their power comes from their collective organization, their willingness to subordinate personal interests to the good of the colony. The story of Azcatl honors this community orientation, presenting the ant not as a solitary hero, but as a member of a kind that knows and guards the secrets of sustenance together. Human civilization, too, depends on community. No individual, however talented, can replicate the achievements of coordinated groups working toward common goals. The great cities of the Aztecs were not built by lone geniuses, but by masses of workers, each contributing their part. The corn that sustained the empire was grown by countless farmers, their efforts accumulated across generations. When we forget the importance of community, when we celebrate individual achievement at the expense of collective welfare, we weaken the foundations of our own society. Finally, there is the lesson of respect for the small. Ants are tiny. They seem insignificant. We step on them without noticing, poison them when they inconvenience us, ignore them as beneath our concern. Yet in the Aztec myth, an ant saves humanity. The smallest creature carries the greatest secret. This lesson extends beyond ants to all the beings we overlook, all the contributions we fail to acknowledge, all the importance we fail to recognize in what seems humble or ordinary. The child who asks the question no adult thought to pose. The worker whose daily labor makes everything else possible. The plant or animal or microorganism that turns out to be essential to systems we barely understand. Respect for the small is not sentimentality, but wisdom. We have traveled far together tonight. From the darkness before creation to the splitting of mountains, from the depths of the underworld to the gardens of paradise. We have walked alongside gods and followed ants through tunnels invisible to ordinary sight. We have learned how corn came to humanity and why a red ant became the savior of our kind. The fifth sun still shines above us, though the Aztecs who named it have passed into history. Their empire fell to conquest. Their temples were torn down, their sacred books were burned, but their story survived. The myth of Azcatl, carried through centuries of colonization and cultural change, still speaks to those who listen. And what does it say? It says that wisdom is where you find it. It says that the small can accomplish what the mighty cannot. It says that sustenance is sacred, a gift that requires proper acknowledgement. It says that we are all connected, gods and mortals and creatures of every size, in a web of mutual dependence that no one can escape. When you walk outside after listening to this story, watch for ants. They are everywhere, going about their ancient business, carrying burdens, building colonies, practicing agriculture as they have for tens of millions of years. They were here before us, and they will likely be here after us. They have survived mass extinctions, ice ages, the rise and fall of countless civilizations. And in their tiny minds, if minds they have, they carry secrets. Not the location of some literal mountain of grain, perhaps, but knowledge nonetheless. Knowledge of how to cooperate across generations. Knowledge of how to build structures that last. Knowledge of how to adapt to changing conditions. Knowledge that we, in our confident modernity, have barely begun to learn. Remember Azcatl. Remember the giant red ant that saved humanity. Remember that when the gods themselves did not know how to feed their creations, a small creature showed the way. And remember that you too might be Azcatl someday. You might possess knowledge that others need. You might know paths that more powerful beings cannot imagine. You might carry within you the secret that saves the world. Be ready to share it when the time comes. Be willing to guide the seeker to the mountain. And be humble enough to do the work, day after day, that keeps the world alive. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the myth of Azcatl, the giant ant. If these ancient stories speak to you, if you want to explore more of the world's mythology and folklore, please subscribe to this channel. We have many more journeys ahead of us, many more secrets to uncover, many more lessons to learn from our ancestors. Hit that like button if you enjoyed this exploration. Share it with others who might appreciate these ancient tales. And leave a comment letting me know what myths you would like to explore in future episodes. Until next time, may you carry your burdens with the strength of an ant. May you find sustenance when you need it most. And may the fifth sun continue to shine upon your path. Sweet dreams.